Hey, welcome back. So we left off and we're just getting everything ready to take this thing apart and finish weld the rest of the bike. But before we do that, we just want to make sure that we didn't forget about anything, because you don't want to take this all apart and realize you forgot like a brake light switch or your voltage regulator or something like that, and then have to put it back together because you wanted to mount it in a specific spot.
It's something you don't want.
Welcome to another edition of Saturday Sportster. I'm going over everything. We got the voltage regulator, the brake light switch, the small stuff that usually gets forgotten about. We definitely took care of those. Before you take this apart, it'd be nice to lay out your wire holes. We're gonna do that in the fender. I haven't drilled those yet. We're gonna do it when the bike's off, because we're also gonna add some clamps in there. But there's places to run some wires through your frame for your headlight. We're going to add another hole on the top of the backbone because we're going to mount the coil and the key switch in that location. So to have ease of wires coming through the back of the backbone and popping out right between the top end, that'll be a great place to have some wires so we don't have to see them hanging down. Because there is actually an existing hole for wires to run through your frame on your Ironhead stock frame. We're going to remember to put that in later once everything's out of the way. But right now, just make sure you didn't forget anything, and we're going to start getting stuff finished. The first thing we're going to do is start with the pipes. Like I said before, we're going to weld these as much as you can on the bike, which will eliminate as much distortion as possible, and get the mounts welded too. So all the spots that you can get to easily, we're going to weld those up, and then we're going to finish the rest off the bench. So we're going to start with that. All right, so here we go. I'm going to weld the mounts first. Now when you're mounting your exhaust, if you have any gaps anywhere, weld those last. Weld the tight spots first, because it'll distort less if you weld the tight spots than if you weld the big gaps. We don't really have too many on this. It seems like a gap, maybe it's just a bevel. Maybe we've got a little one on the bottom, but I would weld those. That kind of stuff is okay. I would just weld that last. Weld the tight spot first. So as we're moving around, I'm just kind of focusing on that. You don't really have to get too hard out of position, but just weld as much as you can on the bike and that you're comfortable with. Also should mention, you're going to want to jump around and don't just go straight around the pipe. You want to control your heat because this stuff is thin, so the more you focus in one specific area, the more distortion you're going to have. When you're welding thin stuff, it's really important to think about controlling the distortion. You're always going to kind of have some. It's going to be inevitable, but just focus on controlling it and don't put too much in one area. I'm gonna try to weld these as much as I can. I'm just kind of jumping around to control the heat that I'm putting into each joint. Now that we got the pipes welded up as much as I want to do on the bike, I just wanted to make one last check. It'd be really good to make sure that your kicker is still going to kick all the way through and not hit your pipe in any locations or up top or anything like that. If you have this problem, it'll be hard to fix later once they're chromes. I already checked this, but it's a good idea to do this. Be easy just to pull out your plugs so you can kick it over without having to like get up on the lift. Because if your bike's kickstart only like this thing is, it'll be really hard to start your bike whacking the exhaust every time. Okay, good. Nice. And if it does hit, if it's just a little bit, you can always bend it out. Say if you wanted to put a header on here and you got like a collector and you need a little bit more room, I have seen these bent out. They also sell different versions where it swivels out and gives you a little bit more clearance. So think about those kind of things, because this does need to move and move freely to start your bike nicely, and you don't want it banging into your exhaust. So I've got the exhaust welded up as much as I'm going to do on the bike, and I'm going to unbolt it and set it aside, and I'm going to start buttoning up the Fender and Sissy Bar now. So I got the seat off and took the taillight off because we don't need those anymore, and I'm just going to be welding whatever's loose in this area. So here we go. I'm gonna get this oil tank out of the way because it doesn't need to be in here anymore, and it'll just make it a lot easier to get in here to weld this mid mount. So I set aside all the sheet metal and the pipes and the Sissy Bar, everything. That's all gonna get finish welded or pressure tested off the bike and on the bench. So now, since we got the bike in this state, I'm just going to finish taking everything apart. So we're gonna be able to prep the frame and get it ready for powder coat or paint, whatever you decide to do, and finish weld anything else that's hard to get to. We'll look it over, and I also still have to drill and tap a hole for the brake light switch. But this doesn't need to be together anymore, so we're just going to finish taking it apart and just separating everything into bins and keeping it organized, getting it ready to go back together for final assembly. So let's finish tearing this thing apart. So we're getting this front end torn apart, and as you can see here, we're getting a little bit of oil getting past the seals. So that's already gonna have to get replaced. But one of the things we were gonna do anyways, we were going to, since we're not running a front brake, we're gonna shave off the fender mounting tabs and this brake tab, and also these reflector mounts to just give it a nice clean look. So this oil leak isn't a big deal. We were probably just gonna replace the oil seals. But if you weren't going to do that, you might not need to actually take your front end all the way apart, but if you have some oil leak getting past the seal, you're gonna wanna replace that. And you can tell, this is a telltale sign, you can see it on both tubes, of the oil getting past, because when this is compressing, the seal isn't actually cleaning off the rest of the oil off the tube, so you get these really pronounced rings on the tubes. So for us, it's not a big deal because we were planning on taking this all the way apart or polishing this or just cleaning this up anyways, because this is a pretty old front end. So, but look for stuff like that, and we're gonna get this thing knocked apart. Oh no. And that's it, all apart. Now we gotta weld everything up so we can send it out. So clearly we've moved to the workbench and I'm gonna finish welding stuff like this up. It's just a little bit easier to get to all these hard to reach places as you weld them just flat on the table. We welded up as much as we could on the bike so that it's not gonna move around, but we're just gonna finish everything up that's left to be welded on the workbench. So let's get to it. On a couple of spots we have a little bit of gaps. Instead of just welding everywhere, now that it's much easier for me to get to any places, I'm definitely gonna get these things tacked all the way around before I'm gonna continue on welding. So now we're working on finishing the fender. I have a couple things that need to be done to this. We've marked this before we took it apart for the bottom of the frame, so we know where to cut the fender at. And so we're going to cut that, but we're also, another thing that we marked was the place for our wire holes. So we're gonna run the wires from the tail light internally through our fender to get down low to where we're gonna make our junction with the brake light switch and the battery and stuff like that to hook up the tail light wires. But this is gonna come out, we need to drill this for a rubber grommet so that the wires can't be chewed up and stuff from just like rubbing on the metal. They'll have a nice grommet to sit in. So we're gonna drill the hole for that, and we're also going to cut the fender so it's not hanging down below our frame. So I already marked that, and I'm gonna just make a nice straight line. This can be kind of eyeballed because I'm gonna clean it up afterwards. I'm just gonna get a rough cut. And try the best you can to lay this out so it's square. But we're also gonna clean it up after I cut it. And that's already looking pretty straight. I'm kind of just setting this fender on its back and just trying to make it a straight line all the way across. And this is, if you can't get it super perfect, it's on the bottom of the motorcycle, so it's not really the biggest deal, but do the best you can. So like I said, I'm just holding it, so I'm working off like a straight line. The top of the fender's flat, so it should potentially sit pretty flat on the table. And then I'm just looking from the back and just trying to get a straight across line. And then we're gonna break these edges and just round them over and kind of just try to make a match on both sides. It's not super critical. Clearly you can do it whatever looks the nicest for you or what style you're going for. But something just as simple as that is all I do, and just so there's no sharp edges there. So I just have a little bit more to do. So now that we have it cut to size and cleaned up at the bottom, we're gonna drill our holes for our rubber grommets for the wires to pass through. These are great to use, gives your wiring a little bit of a buffer between the sheet metal so that when it's rattling in there or just kind of going down the road, your wires aren't gonna get chewed up and you're not gonna lose your tail light. I would pick one of these up, they're like little donuts. You can get them at places like McMaster Car, and I would measure for the thickness of the material and what size, like say how many wires you're gonna run. This one I'm going to be drilling a hole for a 7/16 drill, and that is going to allow me to snap this in, and that's gonna snap right in there and allow me to pass my wires through into the fender really clean. So I would suggest using one of these. And so we're gonna drill the holes top and the bottom where we marked them previously, and then we're gonna move on to the clamp. So let's get to drilling. So now we got the hole drilled, and this fits this rubber grommet real nice. You can just pop this right in here. Gonna be a great place for your wires to pop out of the fender without ever having to worry about your wires getting chewed up from the sheet metal around it. Just a nice little isolator. And now we're going to put our clamps in to secure the wire all the way down the length of the fender. You can find these tiny little clamps basically in like a electrical aisle of any hardware store, and they're just small little sheet metal clamps, but they're perfect for securing your wire inside your fender. And so I take these and I clamp these inside the fender, and I just silicone bronze inside the hole to secure it to the fender. And after it's painted, you'll be able to bend these tabs back, install your wiring, and then bend them closed to hold it nice and tight inside the radius of your fender, far away from your tire. I use probably 4 or 5 of these, but it's really important. I would get one as close as possible to the rubber grommet that you just drilled the hole for, because that wire is going to come out perpendicular to the top of the fender. So it's going to need to bend quickly so you don't get it too close to the tire. So I would put a clamp really close right to that grommet, so when it comes out of your fender, it bends up nice and tight to the roof of the fender, and then you can kind of stagger them along the edge just to hold it close so your wires aren't going to be drooping down and getting caught by your tire. So I usually get these, say about an inch away or so, and it's nice if you use a couple clamps and just clamp it on there, and then we're just going to silicone bronze these in a few spots equally spaced. So like I said, I like to take 2 and I put one probably pretty close, maybe an inch away, but fairly close, just so that bend is nice and tight out of the fender. And then I'll take a couple more, and I think maybe I'll go with 5 total. And I just place them evenly. It doesn't have to be perfect. You could take as much time with this as you want, but I would just, eyeballing them evenly spaced is enough for me, because it's mostly important how close they are right outside of the fender, because that's going to be the part where it's hanging down the most. So after you get it kind of close, okay, so I'm using 5. I usually start with the ends first, and then I lay out the middle afterwards. So we got our tabs welded in here. I used some silicone bronze because the tabs are zinc plated, and it's not really a structural thing. The silicone bronze helps tack to the zinc plated part without burning the zinc that's going to cause you some like blowback and stuff onto your tungsten. So we used silicone bronze and tacked those in there. I tacked on the edge and inside the hole. I filled the hole up like a rosette weld, and that should be enough, strong enough for you to be able to bend the tab back and then run your wire through and then close the tab off, and it'll keep it nice and tight to your fender. I've used a lot of those other like sticky tabs that then you zip tie your wires to, and those always eventually fall off from the inside the fender because all the dirt and grime that's going to get here. These are really securely fastened to the inside of the fender and really aren't going anywhere. If you want, you could also probably MIG weld these pretty easily too. I put these on the left side of the fender because on a Sportster, the chain's on the right, And typically for a lot of guys, they might not be running an 18 with such a skinny fender, and they might actually have to cut for chain relief on one side of the fender, on the right side on a Sportster. If you ran it on the right side, then the wires would have to come up higher or something. So instinctively, I just put them on the left, and it might just suit you better to do the same on any bike that you're gonna do this trick with, to just run it on the opposite side of the chain. That would be a good suggestion. So now we're just gonna weld this up, and then the fender will be ready for paint. Getting close, not much left to do, which is tight. And we're all finished. So now we're onto the rear section of the frame. I'm gonna drill a hole for the brake light switch, and then we're just gonna weld up the miscellaneous tabs that are still left unwelded on here. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so our brake light switch is now mounted since we drilled and tapped a hole. So the only thing left on the frame is to finish weld it up. So that's what I'm going to do now. just visually inspecting everything just before I set it aside. And it all looks good, so all right. So the frame doesn't need a whole lot. All I really need to do is finish weld these two bungs up top, and then I got to drill a hole for my wiring, which is really important in the backbone. Since we're running the gas box top motor mount that takes the coil and the key switch, we need a place for our wires to pop out at the backbone, because Sportster frames all have a spot in the back of the backbone for you to actually be able to run your wires forward from where we're mounting the battery down low. We're going to run them up the seat tubes into the backbone and pop out right out top, right between the rocker boxes of our top end, to cleanly run the wires right to the key switch and the coil. The headlight wire is going to continue on through the backbone and pop out in the front where you can see this hole here. So let's get to that, and it shouldn't take too much to finish, but I'm going to get to welding. There we go. So as you can see, I stepped this up to 7/16. And the next thing you want to do is run the drill in and then tip it at an angle, because the wires are going to be coming parallel with the tube. And so that you don't want to make it so that it's a hard 90 out of the tube. You want to make it so it's a little bit easier to get your wiring in and out of the tube. So what I like to do is I run the drill in, drill the hole nicely, but then stick the drill back in the hole and turn it on, and then slightly tip it so it cuts like a taper into the edge of the tube, which will make your wiring come out really nice. So let's do that. And so now you're almost using your drill as an end mill to kind of cut away and just cut a little bit of an angle to make that transition a little smoother for your wiring. I think I might put a little bit more on this. Okay. The next thing you're going to have to do is get a straight little air grinder and get in there and clean up the burrs really nice, because the last thing you want is any kind of little sharp metal slivers to be able to stab your wiring. So the last thing to do before we send this out to paint is pressure test your oil and your gas tank. I already showed you how to do this in a previous video, and there's a link on your screen for you to be able to click and watch that video. I'm not saying that to expect any leaks in these kind of things. I'm just trying to tell you that this is the time to find them, because there's no easier time to fix a leak in either of these two parts than right now when they're bare. So this is the time to pressure test them before you send them off to paint, because the last thing you want is your gas tank and oil tank freshly painted, and to find out if there's a leak then you'll have to grind it off, whatever, fix it, send it out to paint, get it back on your bike. So right now, even if it's a brand new tank, just pressure test it before you send it off to paint so you know it's good, it's solid, it's ready for paint, and you're not gonna have headaches later. So next time you see this, we'll be putting this back together with fresh paint. So stay tuned.
Ba, 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 ba.